My name is Sister Patty Johnson, and I am the Executive Director of the U.S. Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I am pleased to welcome you to this third in a four-part series on Father Jean-Pierre Médaille and 17th century France. Our speaker today is Sister Anne Hennessey. She is a Sister of St. Joseph of Orange, California, who has a doctorate in theology from the Graduate Theological Union. She wrote her dissertation on Father Jean-Pierre Médaille, who was the founder of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Today, Sister Anne is going to focus on what was occurring in 17th century France among the members of the Society of Jesus. It is my pleasure to introduce Sister Anne Hennessey.
What I'd like to do for this session is to look at the Society of Jesus in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the society as it was when Médaille entered. After the death of Ignatius in 1556, there were two more Spanish generals, Lainez and Borgia, then a German, and in 1581, Acquaviva, an Italian. And he had a reign of over 30 years, almost 34 years. And then he was followed by an Italian, Father Vitelleschi, who reigned for another 30 years. So the only reason I say this is that we have boom, 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 3 Spaniards, 3 from the founding group. Mercurian, who goes for 7 years, but early father. Then we've got these 2 men who are generals for about 30 years each, or over 30 years. So think of the foundation of a congregation and how you normally move from creativity to stability and then to renewal. So you have to look at the Jesuits in this period, in that same sort of framework, from Ignatius and the 3 men that knew him, that lived with him, very good friends with him. Lainez was one of his first followers. Then you come to these 2 long, lengthy administrations. And then we go very quickly through 5 generals in about 25 years. So it's an interesting pattern. Nobody set the pattern because they have lifetime election, their appointments as general are lifetime. So we're going to look then at Médaille, who enters in one of these, the second of these very long Vitelleschi's administration, and then we go to generals that switch frequently. Added on to that, in his lifetime, Médaille's lifetime, and certainly before that, mail service hardly existed. So letters back and forth to Rome, and that was Rome to any of the provinces, including Toulouse, which is fairly close to the border, just furthest south of any of the provinces in Médaille's time. But the communication was really, really slow. And so some of the things that happened to Médaille are going to be influenced by that lack of good communication. I'd like to begin by just a couple of words about how one can look at the history of an order. Certainly the cultures that it lives through, what's going on in the secular world? What are the moods? What are the thoughts? What is being taught? What is being invented or discovered? And certainly in the early years of the society, we have a whole new world discovered. We also have to look at the religious culture. What was the church's self-understanding at that time? A church under siege, as we saw today from Islam and so forth, but also from Protestantism and Protestantism within the areas that the church thought she controlled. The dominant theological styles, the universities, and the ways that theology was taught in the universities. Then there are the hopes and the needs of the faithful. I don't know that we know very much about their hopes. We certainly know that in the late 16th, early 17th century, the needs of the faithful were tremendous. We saw that earlier today, that they did not have education. They did not have the wherewithal to make decisions about life. They were victimized in a whole lot of ways by nature, because of storms and all of these things, that bad crops, all of that sort of thing, but also by the higher levels, the higher tiers of French society. What were some passing religious fashions? We don't think of that too often, but think of the various, how fashionable it was to go to novenas. When I was a kid, everybody in the family had one night a week that they went someplace, to some parish, because it had a certain novena. Think about, in the lifetime of many of us, the change in frequent reception of the sacraments. Tremendous. Think of the numbers of priests and religious women, and now those numbers not so great. What are the fears that move authorities in the church? Now, we just came from a rather fearful pope, and now we've got a totally sort of unfearful one who's not afraid to go out. From popes who very concerned doctrinally, which they have to be, but also of a personality that is more reserved. And then you've got one who's hugging a lot of people that never got hugged by a pope before. So, but I mean, you stop and think about it. This is a real flip here, and we have to say, well, what does that matter? People in Madai's time, let's face it, did not know the popes, and we do, and so we have something to look at. They knew the bishops, and what was it to have a lord as a bishop in Lapuy, to have someone who was as highly placed, whose father had been in the royal court for years, sent on 2 or 3 kings who sent him on different kinds of missions to England and so forth, whose mother was so highly placed, whose family knew the likes of Francis de Sales and Vincent de Paul, and had hired Vincent de Paul on his mother's family's lands. So you're dealing with different kinds of personalities here, and it's good to recall that. There was, of course, devotion to Ignatius, but we're in that period. Remember those wavy things that we used to see about the life and death of religious congregations, and we're on the upsweep, but we've also lost the founder for the Jesuits at this point. So under Borgia, the former Duke of Gandia, all manuscript copies of Ignatius's life story were returned to Rome. And what are we going to do? Any kind of reminiscence about Ignatius that was of singular edification was to be sent to Rome. And from Rome, an official portrait was composed. Not a portrait, but this is who we see Ignatius as. And so that he can be quoted according to whichever quotes you want to cull from his writings. The verbal portraits of Ignatius, and that became a real problem, as Joseph Veal, an English writer, says, emphasized meticulous and finicky observance, without a sense of magnanimity of vision, daring enterprise, or the urgency of mission. Well, come on, go think of what we know now when the biographies of Ignatius abound and the archives are open. Urgency of mission, yeah, He had that. He had some daring enterprise, and he had a tremendous vision. So how can we say he doesn't have a sense of those? Was he finicky? Yeah. Was he meticulous? What founder is not? Yeah. Okay. So, Aquaviva, so this is going to impinge on Madai. Put the structure of the Jesuit life in place. In other words, with the rapid growth of a congregation and its spread, we're going to need to do something to hold it together. Something. Oh my throat.
Do you like that closer to you?
No, I'm okay. Thank you. So, how do you deal with a rapidly growing congregation that is so spread out in all of Europe, plus the East Indies, plus the West Indies, and the only way to get there is on 2 legs or 4 legs, you know? So he's really fighting. They really have a problem here. How do you deal with a world in which everybody's having visions? Well, just about everybody. What is the spiritual writing like of the time of the early 16th, late 16th, and early 17th centuries? What do we have? We have the visions of this person, that person, and the third person. And some we don't even have visions, but we don't even have the writings of. So they were very afraid then of mysticism. They were very afraid that their missionary spirit, their service spirit, was going to be detracted by and distracted by a kind of piety. So they had to go back and try to find again, what does it mean to be contemplatives in action? What does it mean to serve out of a very deep prayer life? And that was not easily found for them. We're used to it, and we say the words, and we can read Jesuit books, and so we get the idea. But not when you're the first or second generation. They did not have yet a theology of their own. They did not have yet much of a culture of their own, and they didn't have a vocabulary. So what they were living, an apostolic congregation, totally given to contemplation in action, they had to find that, and they had to find it without the original leader. They were also hampered by the fact that the theology of the era couldn't handle religious priests given to the apostolate. Religious priests belong in monasteries. And so how could you say you had diocesan priests, but those men earned a living? You know, someday, it wasn't just by saying Mass and hearing confessions. So there were several things that were different about the Society of Jesus that we've sort of lost track of because we're so used to it. But in Madai's time, he was just getting over some of these, or the society was just getting over some of these problems. What did they do? The Jesuits had a perception of ministry that involved the propagation of the faith. That's a humongous term. You know, the propagation of the faith. To whom, where, when, what theology are you following? And what is the progress of souls in Christian life and doctrine? Now, this is going to get them, cause some of the problems they have in these early years. If you're trying to propagate the faith to people who don't have it, then you've got this tremendous missionary outreach. You've got Xavier, you've got some of the others in Madai's time. He was in school with Noel Chabanel, so you've got the French missionaries in Canada. They're facing terrible odds, terrible situations, and they are propagating the faith. And then you've got all the folks in these schools that have churches attached to them. And what are they looking for? How do you progress in your faith? How do you live your faith better? How do you learn about it and learn the interior life? To pay attention to the interior life. We talked earlier today about some of the realities of life people that were farmers all day, people that lived out in these country areas, did not even have the vocabulary to talk about what was going on inside of them on a secular level, very much less on a religious level. We don't have poetry from that class. We don't have poetry or good literature. We have some folk music, but that's about it. So we have to look at what they're doing, what they're trying to do. They also have a universality of mission. You know, we have that, all the spiritual and corporal works of mercy of which a woman is capable in our constitutions, the old constitutions. Where do we get that? What are some of the universalities of their Jesuit ministries in Madai's time? Public preaching and public lectures. So we're encouraging people, we're also informing them. Every ministry whatsoever of the Word of God and of the spiritual exercises. So you could see them on TV and on radio today of whatsoever. You can have a good time with that. Education of children and unlettered persons in Christianity. Spiritual consolation of the faithful, especially through confessions, hearing confessions. Administering the other sacraments. Notice that what a difficulty here. Let me read that again. The spiritual consolation of Christ's faithful, especially through hearing confessions and administering the other sacraments. But the local clergy thought that was their province. Who are these folks coming in, taking over, and having a way about them that is really meeting needs? Reconciling the estranged, holily assisting, I like that word, holily assisting persons in prisons and hospitals, performing other works of charity according to the glory of God and the common good. Now, you talk about discernment. You're going into your superior and you say, I want to perform some works of charity because I think it's for the glory of God and it will help a lot of people. You know how far we get with that? What does the Constitution say? I'm teaching nursing, whatever we used to say. So these are very, very broad. Every one of these is a very broad category. How do you get them to hang together when the categories are so broad? They certainly had a special care for the catechism, basic knowledge of the Catholic faith, especially the sacraments, and as soon as you get to penance, then it's the category of sins, commandments, creeds, and so forth. But then, what did they really want to do? They wanted to take people from the commandments to the Beatitudes. How are you with other people? How do you serve other people? And then they want to take people the step further. Do you relish spiritual things? Now, this morning we talked a little bit about what it was like for some of these women and men living in places that didn't have enough food, that they didn't have enough clothes, so they couldn't go out if it was laundry day. How do you get someone like that to relish spiritual things? So they really had an agenda for themselves, which we probably don't appreciate so much today because this is not our culture and this is not the Jesuits that we know. They had a lot of tensions. The biggest tension was the stability of the schools and the desire to be missionaries. And how did they balance those two? And they were always fussing about it. You've got too many men are stuck in the school. Somebody called them the tombs of the society, are the schools. You got too many people stuck there. And then you say, what about, we're here slaving with these kids, and you're out, sailing the 7 seas. Well, that doesn't look too good either. So, but that's the tension that they have within themselves. And so how do they try to handle this? Another was the ministry without recompense. So their idea is they never ask for a stipend. Well, that's very lovely. If there are any procurators in the room, you can only take that one so far. Their institutions had to have stable incomes. So you've got these people professing solemn profession of poverty and wanting to live like the missionaries and live the ideal of Ignatius the Pilgrim. And you've got this humongous institution to run. And you've got to run it not just for poor kids, but for really rich kids too. You have to be able to put on extravaganzas that the opposite ends of your local society can both attend at the same time. How do you do it? How do you even find a language that they can both understand? You have the tension of internal consolation and confessional orthodoxy. Now, that does not mean that they were heretics, but it means what happens when God is really speaking to someone and they identify that pretty clearly. They are living the life. It's not extreme, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the order of the institution. This happened a lot in France. It also happened in Poland that we know about. These young men were coming into the society and put in the classroom, and they couldn't stand it. And so they were locking themselves in their rooms to save their souls. And, the superior would come, Father, we need you in the classroom. I can't go there because the damn kids, I guess it said something of that nature, or, it's driving me crazy. I'm going to commit sins if I go down and handle these kids. So it's important to see that a final tension they had was that of ministerial independence. And they still have that. This is, a Jesuit institution. Talk to those of us who co-sponsor institutions. And the dependence on benefactors. So we want to do what we want to do when we want to do it because we have prayed and discerned about this. Now, unless you've got your benefactors praying and discerning with you, you got a problem. So, what are the ways of handling this? Xavier was always, be tender. Don't be rigid. See the problem. Seeing the suffering of the men that you are dealing with. Favre went back to 1 Corinthians. Look at this with flexibility and with compassion. In other words, he was ready to, I wouldn't say bargain, but at least to try to find a common ground with the people with whom he worked. So it was not a growth that was not a growth that was without problems. No, none of us has had a growth that has not been had its problems, had warring ideologies or warring circumstances to them. So how did they manage their ministries? They took on this phrase, our way of proceeding, and they will still do, this is the way we do it, and they all do it that way. So it's our way of proceeding, and they'll flip it out every once in a while if you're with them. Refer everything to God. Act from the heart, but be practical. In the heart, they put feelings and speculation together. So they don't say heart is just romantic. Their heart has an intellectual capacity or a component of the intellect as they're writing about this. They care deeply, and they'll think in terms of how do we express care. When they do individual discernments, it's how do I express the care I feel within the discipline of the vocation, of the order. Learning to them then became not only essential to ministry, but a matter of piety. So, and I think that's crept down to us a little bit in the sister formation movement. It certainly did that. Yes, part of who you are, but it's part of your relationship with God is to be prepared for your ministry. Private prayer and Eucharist were always foremost to them. They do not have prayer in common. And they fostered what Ignatius called consolation. Consolation, I'll just read it from the spiritual exercises. Ignatius describes consolation as some inward movement of the soul, whereby the soul begins to be on fire with the love of her Creator and Lord, and consequently she can love no created thing on the face of the earth, but only in the Creator of them all. So this is not consolation that says they're there now, everything will be all right. It's that we love everything in God who is the Creator. Likewise, when she bursts into tears out of love for her Lord, be it for grief over her sin, or over the passion of the Lord, or over matters directly ordered to his service and praise, she is also showing consolation. In short, consolation is any increase of faith, hope, and charity, any inward joy that calls and attracts to heavenly things and to the salvation of one's soul, rendering the soul restful and pacifying her in her Creator and Lord. So I think it's that the description of consolation is very important, because if that's a guide to ministry, it doesn't mean there you'll feel better in the morning. It means, where are you vis-a-vis your Lord, and do you feel with your Lord? It's also very interesting that it's a male order that speaks so convincingly of feelings, and they depend on feelings in discernment, but you don't find it in a lot of feminine orders. So they're trying to see then that the whole Reformation that they're working on at this period is really a pastoral problem. It's not just a theological problem. It's how do you work with people, how do you love people, how do you help them get closer to the Lord. So what are the spiritual conditions of a person? That's why tomorrow when we read some of the letters from Madai, from the home missions, we'll see that over and over again. We see people suffering. We see people without a shepherd. We see people who can't get to confession because there's no priest here. So they're constantly meeting people to whom they go out with this real feeling of how do we take care of them pastorally, and what is their spiritual condition. They'll do it doctrinally, but they won't start with doctrine, and they don't talk about, oh, they've got this thing, they don't know this and they don't know that, and they've got, flunked catechism really well. They don't start there. They start with, how are they? How are they feeling? What are they going through? For them, then, the ministry of the Word of God was a matter of the heart and not just of a mind. How many orders of men can you say that about? How many orders of women can you say that about? So, excuse me. And that brings us then to consolation, or to devotion. How open is the person to God? How open is the minister to the work of God? To seeing something and receiving something that comes from God. How open is one to having one's heart moved? So the spirituality that they're writing about here and that they're seeking to implement is, in some sense, I think we'd say today, almost feminine in its evocation of emotion and of heart and of compassion. Much of this, of course, came up for them in the sacrament of penance. Why were they so popular, and still are, as confessors? They were very much against the whole idea of anxiety about salvation and guilt. They were about the love of God and the return of love of God. What is a relationship? To them, then, confession was a practice of consolation. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? An interesting take on it. And this was, some of the scholastic theologians were the same, and they taught about the consolation of penance. But in practice, that was not very popular in the 17th century. And that's why a lot of people had fallen away. And of course, when we talk about the places that Madai went, these little tiny towns that you can see on the map there, far away from everything, those people had no pastoral care. So how do you go to people like that? You can't blame them for a care that was not provided to them. They did a lot of emphasis in Ignatius, it comes from Ignatius and it's in the Constitution, on private prayer. It's a priority. It's not communal prayer for them. There is a tremendous emphasis on Eucharist, Corpus Christi, processions, frequent communion. Very little, though, about reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. So it would be interesting, I guess, especially in the missions, they couldn't go away and leave the Blessed Sacrament unattended in these tiny churches. They also see consolation as a spiritual eagerness, as a desire to serve God. And that's what they try to teach the folks, as we will see. How then did they deal with women? This comes from John O'Malley in his book, The First Jesuits. As time went on, they tried to lay down for themselves some restrictions on hearing the confessions of women. This is interesting, because in Ignatius's time, when you read the biographies of how he acted in Rome, he was out every day, limping through Rome, to the houses of, Margaret of Austria, who's the daughter of the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, and to the Duchess of this and the Countess of that, all of whom had large households. So he would hear the confessions weekly, not only of the titled ladies, of the next layer, their ladies in waiting, and then go all the way down to the ladies in the kitchen. So for himself, Ignatius himself, they did have a real devotion to that. And then, of course, he founded St. Martha's for women that were abandoned for one reason or another. Without hesitation, they enlisted women to help them and entrust them with responsible positions, including guiding other women into a deeper spiritual life. As with men, the Jesuits guided them in the spiritual exercises and outside the exercises. They taught them how to meditate. Occasionally, they preached against customs that discriminated against women's freedom in religious practice and succeeded in having those practices changed. This does not mean that they were free of the standard prejudices against the, quote, weaker sex. In general, the Jesuits' practice in dealing with women was much better than their talk about it. As was often the case, the vocabulary they inherited was inadequate for the reality they lived, or at least wanted to live. I read this because some people say, this is the Jesuit who founded the Congregation of Women, and they're not supposed to be working with women. Well, come on. Ignatius did it. He founded St. Martha's. CSJs were not St. Martha's ladies. So, let's not go there. What were some of the problems faced by the Jesuits of Madai's time? First of all, there were a lot of defections. A lot of men entered, and then when they saw this new form of religious life, in which the spirituality of service is as important as the spirituality of contemplative prayer, they got very uneasy with it. In the late 16th century, over a third of those who entered left. And they left because of this uneasiness about ministry entering. The letters from the French Jesuits to Rome. The first problem they talk about is that it's hard to write in Latin. Isn't that a very French thing to say? French like their own language. There's a problem with people. Problem people usually get more attention than the good guys. Okay, that's true every place, isn't it? What are the complaints that they talk about? Dissensions and quarreling, lack of religious zeal, too much concern with family matters, Some superiors did not cope well with authority. Others were ruthless. Some wanted more rules and regulations. Some went by the book, or as one writer put it, wanted an ever-lengthening book. And provincials squabbled over inadequate finances and personnel. So, yeah, we can talk about it. You could get a letter like that, I'm sure, today from any superior, theirs or ours. The third thing that they were very aware of in the 17th century was the foundation of the parish confraternities. And they were great for getting people together, because when you got people together, that's how they supported each other. That's how you keep people going. And particularly in these outlying districts, in these little tiny villages and so forth. But that's not going to make you popular with the pastors. You're coming in and organizing the parishioners to one kind of spirituality, which the pastor may or may not be part of or sympathetic with. And so this foundation of confraternities, and then if the confraternities got bigger and bigger, then there was competition and so forth. There was a lot of complaint from the Jansenists in particular that the Jesuits gave absolution too easily. And that the Jesuits, therefore, as confessors, were more popular than more exacting confessors. Now, how you know all this, I don't know. I mean, we grew up on the seal of confession, so how you know all this? Jesuit criticism of clerical abuse and ignorance was seen as interfering in the rights and prerogatives of the bishops and the other clergies. So you have a right to be uneducated, I guess. Jesuits did not accept stipends for preaching, and that seems to be the big issue. Several people say that's the real problem here. There was a rapid growth. We'll see this with Father Madai. There are 27 people in the novitiate. What happens then when you're trying to form people in such a way of life in which personal responsibility is really the norm? And as they go out and as they mature as Jesuits, they are left on their own. Some of them live in community, especially these guys. They frequently traveled by twos. And Madai, we know that, had a companion, Associus, they call him, with him all the time. But that was a problem for him. Some of the French Jesuits had to teach so long and so early in their formation that they never progressed in their Jesuit formation and in their theological studies, so they didn't make what the Jesuits call final vows. You know about that? Jesuits make the 3 vows. They make simple perpetual vows, and if they're called to make a 4th vow, that of obedience to the Pope, then that's their final vows. So they make simple perpetual vows just like we do, but they don't call them final vows. Okay. So the thing was that if they didn't finish their theology, they could not make the solemn vows. Because the solemn vows puts them, that's the category of Jesuit that is put at the service of the Holy Father for any kind of mission. So if they didn't have a complete theological education, they were not considered eligible for any kind of mission. There was a lot of antagonism against the non-French Jesuits working in France, and that's because some countries, particularly Poland, had more vocations than France did. And France had this growing school population, and so there was a little rivalry there. Problems caused by those who left the society, and the issues about honor of the society versus the humility of the members. That's kind of interesting. I've never heard that brought up as a problem before. There's difficulty, and this is, John O'Malley writes about this, distinguishing the honor and glory of God from the honor and glory of the society. And we'll let them figure that out, said by Jesuit. How did they get involved in the spiritual renewal in the 17th century? So what are some of the things that Madai and his friends did? First of all, lots of sodalities, lots of confraternities. We might say, why? It's because this was not an individual society or a society of individuals. They had to group together. Many people were grouped by profession or by trade. This is not a lone ranger or the society of individuals. So how is it that you bring devout and charitable people together in piety and in active charity? Whether it's adults, and so you're talking about parish confraternities, or whether it's the sodalities in the schools. The second thing that they did a great deal in France was the publication of spiritual books and we would call it spiritual reading material. Again, it's O'Malley who says of little literary merit. But he calls them spiritual exercises. I'm not sure that is possible. Then there's the ministry of spiritual direction. In the 17th century, and when we read about Madai, you'll hear him called the confessor, because most spiritual direction at that time took place in the confessional. But they were known as spiritual directors. So people spending a half hour in the confessional was not unusual there. And instead of meeting somebody in a room, they met them in the confessional. And that's why in the Jesuit Colleges, and we can talk about this, the church was always open onto the public square, so people couldn't come in, and there were confessors there all day long, if they had enough men to so provide that. Some were involved in newly formed retreat houses. The first retreat houses of the society were opened in France, up in the northwestern part of the country. There was also the reform and establishment of religious congregations. This is kind of interesting. Sometimes they worked with individual reformers, Carmelites, Benedictines, and they usually did it with women, but through confession and spiritual direction. They helped with the foundation of some women's orders, the Ursulines, Notre Dame de Bordeaux, the Order of the Incarnate Word in Lyon. The CSJs, though, are the only example of a Jesuit writing a constitution, and that's what's so different, and that's what got him in trouble. Small t trouble. They were very active in promulgating devotion to the Sacred Heart, to Our Lady as a mediatrix of all grace, to Saint Joseph, and to poor souls in purgatory. If you look in 17th century Jesuit writing, you'll find that Madai is not alone in the dedication of the congregation to Saint Joseph. There's a lot of Jesuit work that is pointing to Saint Joseph, especially with boys and running these boys' schools, running these confraternities for men, that it's natural that Joseph is going to be the model, and they will write about him and speak about him a lot. There was the home mission movement, and we'll talk about that tomorrow when we talk about Madai and what his work was. And then all the things that you would normally associate with Jesuit direction, spiritual direction. Eucharistic devotion, the humanity of Christ, mental prayer, good works, individual response to grace, or the examine, the looking at one's life, and an asceticism that is called reasonable. It is never extreme. It never takes away energy from work or from ministry. There is one other thing that I think I would like to share with you. I have it on the table here. Not that one. This one? That one. Yes, Teresa has it. And that is an overview of Jesuit or Ignatian spirituality. And it helps. this will help us to understand Madai a little bit, and also to understand the spirituality of our documents that he wrote for us. Because yeah, no, that's okay. I jumped ahead of you. I'm sorry. And actually, it helps with this paper to read it down, because what Ignatius presents is a vision of God. God as creator, and then Christ as present, incarnate, struggling. Because of that vision, there is a realization that everything speaks of God and that everything is directed by Christ to the Father. There is a response, service that is total, universal, the more the better, and that is also contemplative. And in terms of Christ, that response can be worked out only in companionship, that is imitation, active and passive imitation, that is profound, penetrating. Sometimes it's literal. Among some of the missionaries, Jesuit missionaries, certainly was an attempt to be the most literal. That's why they accepted martyrdom and sometimes sought it the way they did. And then how is the response is determined. What is proper for me? What is the proper way for me to respond? We use tools such as discernment, indifference, abnegation, and obedience. So those are the helps to response. And the disposition is one of generosity, affection, and humility. Now, if you look at this, you'll notice that there's not very much about the Holy Spirit. And that is because of the period in which Ignatius lived and the problems with the Inquisition and the Illuminati, who were always saying the Spirit spoke directly to them and they did not need to go to any authority, human authority, such as the church. They could bypass the church. But obviously, when you look at Ignatius and you look at his life and his writings, the Spirit of God is what is informing and giving the impetus to all of this. Notice that I think one of the key words here, almost all of these words are Ignatian words that we're used to. But look at affection. So often Ignatius is the soldier, the guy who could send people off to India or to Japan, at a moment's notice, the one who could give penances to brothers and fathers rather easily, etc. And yet there is always for him an element of affection in our relationship to God. And that, I think, is very, very important, because you don't find that word appearing in very much spiritual theology, if any, or if any other spiritual theology. I'd like to finish with... You're good. Huh? You're good. I'm good, okay. Because I'd like to go on to say something about the Jesuit Colleges, because they're so important to Madai's own education and to the places where he was always based, as we will see tomorrow. And this is, you don't have this on paper. Ignatius saw the colleges as religious centers. As somebody else, it would be the parish. The Jesuits didn't have parishes. So for them, the closest they could get to that was the college. And so the college always had a chapel. The college always had sodalities, whether they were the young men in the college or their fathers. The colleges were the places where the mothers of the boys would meet, the Mothers' Guild, only it was a ladies' sodality, and it was pious. So what they were trying to do is make religious centers that what is an upright Christian life in the world. And that's what they were trying to form people for. So they were not merely schools. They were to be, in Ignatius's words, geographic, social, and economic bases for various forms of evangelization. They were the centers from which everything spread out. The impetus in France came from civil and religious dignitaries. A lot of people invited the Jesuits in. They realized the problems that they had in Catholicity and in the rise of Protestantism. They were meant to revitalize the faith, especially through sermons. And the sermons to destroy heresy, to reform morals, but to go to a Jesuit sermon became a social event. It was not just part of Mass. It was not just the homily, what we would call a homily at Mass. How does one, in general, Christianize society? That's what they were looking for. What made the colleges unique was that they blended things that were, a rational kind of learning on the one hand, and exotic tales of missionaries and different kinds of literature on the other. They were very logical. They could also be very romantic. The morally disciplined religion of the Roman Catholic Reformation, that's what they were about. It was morally disciplined, but you use whatever you have in your society to further that education and that formation. So Ignatius wrote that the colleges were to offer a thoroughly upright life of Christian virtue and prayer. Prayer he defines here, or describes, as desires in the presence of the Lord. They would offer availability of the sacraments, spiritual conversations or spiritual direction, and the corporal works of mercy. And most of that took place through the sodalities, through the groups that they formed. The curriculum, as we probably know, classical philosophy, classical theology, Thomas Aquinas, facility in writing, style in formal writing, and so forth. The study of classical literature, and then the preparation of students for a life of public service. How did you do all this? So you have some unique things for their time in a Jesuit school. You've got sodalities. You've got groups that pray together, that do charitable work together. You have these elaborate ballets or performances where you have humility one day in the works of service you do, and the next day you're in a tutu for a boy, and some of those pictures, that's what they look like they're in, performing for the foreign minister of France. It's amazing way in which sort of opposites are brought together, things that wouldn't always put together. Every day there was daily Mass. The boys were made to fast frequently. There was participation in Vespers on Sundays, daily examen of conscience for the students as well as for the Jesuits, and confession and communion at certain intervals. So they were really introducing a new kind of education. They were getting the boys young and forming them in a certain discipline. What were some of the productions that they had? This is kind of interesting. They had poetry and pageants based on mathematics and geography. Wouldn't you love to hear a poem based on, maybe it's the rhythm. I don't know, that's a plan. Given at Christmas and Easter, there were award ceremonies. The Jesuit ballet was a partist to oratory. They believed that these productions had a morally didactic purpose. That not only were they good for the parents and the city in general, they were good for the boys who took part in them. So when you had a Jesuit education, you could speak. Have you ever been to a Jesuit graduation?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Have you ever come out? You see these kids that are 14 years old. They're coming out. They're squaring the corners. I mean, come on, no slouching allowed, and it's very formal and very disciplined. Not because they're not like that all day long. When they get to college, they certainly are not like that. But the high school, if you go down to the high school, you will see that. They also did a lot to promote the missionary ideal. They brought missionaries into the schools. They read the letters from the foreign missionaries. They had floor-to-ceiling paintings of the missionaries on the staircases. Frequently, when they had lost their hands and their fingers were cut off and that sort of thing. So they were not pretty pictures. They were usually in the center of the schools. Why I'm doing this is that it helps to see what Madai was, how he was educated. Because he went to the school from the time he was 9 or 10 and entered when he was 16. So he had this whole range of practices and an ambience of looking at the faith and of also talking about the faith and spreading. There was the great fear that came from the Fathers General was that the zeal of the colleges would dominate the apostolate. And so they're constantly then working. How many missionaries can you send out from a house or a college so that we've still got that outreach, even though we're educating people in these towns? And when you look at the French towns, Le Puy is the largest, but Saint-Flour, Aurillac, Clermont-Ferrand, Rodez, all of them had their Jesuit college. And they're all, and they go out from there to these outlying areas. Some people said that too much talent of the society is going to the petty affairs of the colleges, the tombs of the society. Bangor, a more recent author, says, no single field of the apostolate so absorbed the energies of the Jesuits as the running of schools. But there was zeal. There was tremendous zeal. How could you have outside ministries? How could you form people to go out? So we can look at the colleges then as a two-edged sword for the society. There is a description of a college in Carcassonne, located in the highest part of the city. A record of October 5th, 1633 refers to a totally uncomfortable chapel, classrooms that are unfit for use, walls with dangerous cracks. In addition, the college is located in an unhealthy area far from the center of habitation. The health of the fathers and the students suffers most of all from the violent winds. It's freezing in winter, stifling in summer, and many say that they have become ill. So much for Father Madai and to school.